Natalie Roberts had always taken pride in her home, a charming two-story house nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The driveway was her personal sanctuary, spacious, lined with well-kept flower beds and bordered by neatly trimmed hedges that provided both privacy and a sense of accomplishment. For Natalie, this home wasn't just a place to live, it was a reflection of her independence and hard work. She had poured countless hours into maintaining every corner of her property, from the colorful plants she meticulously nurtured to the smooth pavement of the driveway she kept spotless. For her, the driveway wasn't just functional, it was a small yet significant extension of her identity. Life in the neighborhood was peaceful for the most part, though Natalie preferred to keep her interactions with the locals to a minimum. She was polite and cordial, but never went out of her way to form close connections. Among the more sociable residents was Karen Watson, Natalie's immediate neighbor. Karen was the type who thrived on being at the center of attention, organizing community events, and being a self-appointed ambassador of neighborhood harmony. On more than one occasion, Karen had stopped by unannounced, brimming with ideas for various projects that she claimed would benefit the community. Natalie usually humored these interactions with polite nods and vague responses, ensuring she didn't encourage Karen's intrusive nature. Karen was a master of feigned friendliness, but Natalie had long sensed an underlying tone of condescension in her neighbor's words. Karen often commented on Natalie's driveway, calling it a gem just sitting there, unused. While Natalie dismissed these remarks as idle chatter, Karen's fixation on the space was starting to feel odd. On one occasion, Karen mentioned how the wide, well-maintained driveway could be a real asset to the community, and dropped hints about organizing events that could bring people together. Natalie didn't give it much thought, assuming Karen was just being her usual overbearing self. But Karen's comments began to escalate. She started stopping by more frequently, talking about how much potential Natalie's property had, and how the driveway was too beautiful not to be shared. Natalie maintained her polite but firm boundaries, making it clear that her property was her own, and that she wasn't interested in hosting or participating in any neighborhood activities. Karen, however, had a way of brushing off resistance with her trademark sugary smile, often concluding their conversations with phrases like, "Well, you'll come around eventually." Natalie's patience began to wear thin, but she didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. Her approach was simple: avoid Karen as much as possible and hope she'd lose interest. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. One day, as Natalie was pruning the flowers along her driveway, Karen appeared out of nowhere, carrying a tray of cookies and a too-bright smile. "I've been thinking," Karen began, handing Natalie the tray without waiting for an invitation. "Your driveway is just perfect for something special. Have you ever thought about hosting a little market? Maybe something for the neighborhood? It would bring so much life to the area." Natalie glanced at the cookies, then at Karen's overly eager expression. "I'm not sure about that," she replied cautiously. "I really value my privacy, and I don't think I'd be comfortable with something like that." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, of course I understand. But just think about it. The whole neighborhood would appreciate it so much. It's such a perfect space, and honestly, it's just going to waste sitting empty like this." Natalie stiffened at Karen's words but managed a tight smile before excusing herself back into the house. As the days went on, Natalie noticed Karen spending more time lingering near her property. She'd find her neighbor strolling along the driveway, pretending to admire the flowers, or chatting with passers-by about all the amazing things that could be done with the space. It was starting to feel intrusive, but Natalie told herself it was harmless. She couldn't have known that Karen's obsession with her driveway was about to turn her quiet life upside down. Then, one Monday morning, Natalie woke to the sound of rumbling engines and loud voices outside her window. Pulling back the curtains, she froze. Her driveway, her carefully maintained private driveway, was filled with food trucks. Brightly painted vehicles selling tacos, coffee, and ice cream lined the space, their generators humming loudly and their vendors setting up tables and chairs. Strangers were milling about, chatting and laughing, as if they were at a festival. Natalie stared in disbelief, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding in her yard. She rushed outside, her heart pounding with a mix of confusion and anger. "What is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the chatter. The crowd parted, and Karen emerged, her smile as radiant as ever. Oh, good morning, Natalie, she chirped. Isn't it fantastic? I organized a little food truck event for the neighborhood. I thought it would be the perfect way to use your driveway, so much potential, you know. Natalie felt her jaw drop. You did what? Karen's smile didn't waver. I knew you'd be thrilled. It's just a small event, really. I've been talking about it for weeks. Don't you remember? Everyone loves it already. Natalie's voice rose, her composure slipping. You didn't ask me. This is my property, Karen. You can't just set this up without my permission. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Oh, don't be so uptight, Natalie. It's for the community. You're the perfect host. And besides, it's not like you're using the space for anything. Natalie was too stunned to respond immediately. The audacity of it all was overwhelming. Strangers were walking across her driveway, using her electricity for their food truck setups, and Karen had the nerve to act as though she was doing Natalie a favor. The sense of violation was palpable, and for the first time Natalie realized just how far Karen was willing to go to get what she wanted. As Natalie stood there, her fists clenched at her sides, she knew this wasn't going to end with a polite conversation. Karen had crossed a line, and Natalie was going to make sure it didn't happen again. Natalie Roberts was still reeling from the chaos Karen had brought to her driveway. The impromptu food truck lot was not only a complete invasion of her privacy, but also a blatant overstep. By the time the trucks left that evening, her once pristine driveway was stained with oil spills, her garden beds were trampled, and discarded paper cups and wrappers littered the space. Karen, of course, acted as though nothing was wrong. Wasn't today amazing, she said as Natalie stood on her porch, glaring at her. The turnout was incredible. I think this could become a regular thing. Natalie didn't respond. She was too furious to trust herself to speak. Instead, she went inside and spent the evening cleaning up the mess left behind, muttering under her breath about Karen's audacity. She had never been one for confrontation, but this had gone too far. Karen had to be told, in no uncertain terms, that this was unacceptable and would not happen again. The next morning, Natalie marched over to Karen's house, determined to put an end to the madness. Karen greeted her with the same overly bright smile as always, as if she hadn't turned Natalie's property into her personal event space just the day before. Oh, hi, Natalie. What a lovely surprise. Natalie didn't waste time on pleasantries. Karen, we need to talk about what happened yesterday. You had no right to set up that event on my driveway without asking me. Karen's smile didn't falter, but her tone took on a hint of condescension. Oh, Natalie, I thought we already talked about this. It was for the community. Everyone loved it. Don't you want to be a good neighbor? This has nothing to do with being a good neighbor, Natalie snapped. You used my property without my permission, and you left a mess for me to clean up. My driveway isn't public property, Karen. It's mine. Karen sighed dramatically, as though Natalie were being unreasonable. I don't see why you're so upset. It's not like I did anything bad. If anything, I improved the space. Think of it as a little donation to the neighborhood. People appreciate things like this, you know. Natalie's patience was wearing thin. Karen, let me be very clear, you do not have my permission to use my driveway for anything, now or in the future. If you try something like this again, I'll be forced to take action. For the first time, Karen's smile wavered. Take action, she echoed, a slight edge creeping into her voice. What kind of action, Natalie? I'll call the authorities if I have to, Natalie said firmly. This is my property, Karen, and you need to respect that. Karen's expression darkened. Well, I didn't realize you were so selfish, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Here I was, thinking you'd want to contribute to the community. But I guess I was wrong. Selfish, Natalie repeated, her voice rising. Karen, you trespassed on my property and used it without permission. If anyone's being selfish, it's you. Karen crossed her arms, her smile now completely gone. Fine, she said coolly. If you want to be that way, go ahead. But don't be surprised if the rest of the neighborhood doesn't take kindly to your attitude. Natalie didn't dignify that with a response. She turned on her heel and walked away, her hands shaking with anger. As she crossed back into her yard, she resolved to keep a close eye on Karen. Something told her this wasn't over. Over the next few days, Natalie began noticing subtle changes. People who usually waved or stopped to chat with her on their morning walks suddenly seemed distant. Conversations with neighbors became shorter, more awkward, and filled with veiled references to not wanting to stir the pot. It didn't take long for Natalie to realize that Karen had been spreading her version of events around the neighborhood, painting Natalie as the villain who had selfishly shut down a wonderful community event. The breaking point came when Natalie received her electricity bill for the month. It was nearly double what she usually paid. At first she thought it must have been a mistake, but then she remembered the food trucks. They had been plugged into her outdoor outlets all day, sucking up electricity for their generators. Furious, Natalie called the utility company to confirm her suspicions. Sure enough, the spike in usage corresponded perfectly with the day of the event. She stormed over to Karen's house once again, this time clutching the bill as evidence. Karen opened the door, looking unfazed by Natalie's obvious anger. "Back so soon?" she asked sweetly. "You owe me an explanation," Natalie said, holding up the bill. "Or better yet, you owe me money. Look at this. My electricity bill is through the roof because of your little stunt." Karen glanced at the bill and shrugged. "Oh, that? I didn't think it would be a big deal. The trucks needed power, and you had outlets. It's not like I asked them to use it, they just figured it was fine. You should take it as a compliment. They thought your property was accommodating." Natalie could barely believe what she was hearing. "A compliment," she repeated. "Karen, they stole my electricity." "That's theft." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a little electricity. I'm sure you can afford it." "That's not the point," Natalie shot back. "You're responsible for this, Karen. You organized the event, and you let them use my outlets without asking. You need to pay for this." Karen's expression hardened. "I don't think I owe you anything, Natalie. You're making a big deal out of nothing. Honestly, it's a little embarrassing." "Embarrassing," Natalie said, her voice rising. "You embarrassed yourself when you trespassed on my property and let strangers use my resources without permission. If you don't make this right, I will take legal action." Karen didn't respond. She simply closed the door in Natalie's face. Natalie stood there for a moment, stunned. Karen had crossed every line imaginable, and yet she acted as though she were the victim. It was infuriating. As Natalie walked back to her house, she resolved to document everything: the unauthorized use of her property, the electricity theft, and Karen's dismissive attitude. If Karen thought she could get away with this, she had another thing coming. But as Natalie began to take steps to protect herself, she noticed that Karen wasn't backing down. Instead, she seemed to double down on her campaign to paint Natalie as the neighborhood villain. A few days later, Natalie found a flyer tucked into her mailbox, advertising another community event to be held on her driveway. The flyer featured cheerful graphics and bold text reading, "Backed by popular demand. Food Truck Festival this Saturday." Natalie stared at the flyer in disbelief. Karen hadn't even bothered to tell her about this one. She had just assumed it would happen. Natalie felt a surge of anger and dread. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop unless Natalie made her. This time, Natalie wasn't going to wait until the trucks showed up to act. She began making phone calls, determined to put an end to Karen's antics once and for all. If Karen wanted a fight, Natalie was ready to give her one. Natalie spent the days leading up to the supposed food truck festival feeling like a storm was brewing. Karen's flyer had been casually distributed across the neighborhood, yet no one had bothered to check with Natalie, the actual property owner. It was as though Karen had succeeded in convincing everyone that her driveway was some kind of public space, free to be used at will. The audacity of it all churned in Natalie's stomach as she prepared for the weekend. This time she wasn't going to be caught off guard. The first thing she did was consult her lawyer, Rachel Turner, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for handling neighborhood disputes with precision and efficiency. Natalie explained everything: the previous food truck invasion, the unauthorized use of her electricity, the skyrocketing bills, and now the flyer announcing another event. Rachel listened carefully, taking notes as Natalie spoke. When Natalie finished, Rachel leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the notepad. "This is a blatant case of trespassing and misuse of private property," she said. Karen has no legal grounds to do any of this. However, the challenge will be proving intent. People like her often try to blur the lines and make it seem like a misunderstanding or an honest mistake. That's why we need to build a solid case. What do you suggest? Natalie asked. First, document everything. Photos, videos, written records, anything that shows Karen's actions and their impact on you. Second, I'll send a cease and desist letter to Karen, formally warning her that any further use of your property without permission will result in legal action. If she ignores it, we'll escalate from there. Relieved to have a plan, Natalie returned home and began preparing. She installed a new set of outdoor cameras to capture any unauthorized activity on her property. She also made sure to save copies of the flyer, her electricity bills, and receipts for the damage done to her garden during the last event. On Saturday morning, Natalie woke early and checked the cameras. The driveway was quiet for now, but she wasn't naive enough to think it would stay that way. By mid-morning, the rumble of engines broke the silence, and Natalie watched in disbelief as food trucks began arriving, one after another parking in her driveway as though they owned it. Strangers spilled out of the vehicles, unloading tables, chairs, and banners. Natalie wasted no time. She marched outside, phone in hand, recording the scene as she confronted Karen, who was already bustling around, directing the chaos with her usual self-assured grin. Karen, Natalie called, her voice cutting through the noise. Karen turned, her expression flickering briefly with surprise before settling into her usual mask of cheerful indifference. Oh, hi, Natalie. Isn't this exciting? The trucks came back because everyone loved last time so much. Natalie didn't bother with pleasantries. This is my property, Karen, and I didn't give you permission to do this. Again. I've already told you once, and now I'm telling you for the last time, get off my driveway. Karen's smile tightened, and a few nearby vendors paused what they were doing to watch the exchange. Natalie, don't be like this, Karen said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. You're making a scene in front of everyone. This is for the neighborhood, not just you. I don't care who it's for, Natalie snapped. You're trespassing. All of you are. Leave now, or I'm calling the police. At the mention of the police, a murmur spread through the small crowd that had begun to gather. Karen's smile faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Go ahead, she said, crossing her arms. Call them. I have permits for this event, and they'll tell you the same thing. Natalie narrowed her eyes. Permits? Show them to me. Karen hesitated for just a moment, and Natalie caught at a flicker of doubt that told her Karen was bluffing. I don't have them with me right now, Karen said smoothly, but they're filed with the local council. You're welcome to check. I already did, Natalie said, her voice cold. There are no permits for this event, and you know it. This is illegal, Karen. Karen's confidence wavered, but she wasn't ready to back down. Fine, she said, her voice rising. If you want to ruin this for everyone, go ahead. Call the police. Let them explain to you how ridiculous you're being. Natalie didn't waste any more time arguing. She stepped away and dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation calmly but firmly. As she spoke, she noticed Karen talking animatedly to a group of vendors, likely trying to spin the story in her favor. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. Natalie greeted them, grateful for their professional demeanor. She explained what was happening and handed them the cease and desist letter Rachel had prepared earlier in the week. The officers listened carefully before approaching Karen, who immediately launched into a performance worthy of an Oscar. Oh, officers, I'm so glad you're here, she said, clasping her hands together. This is just a little misunderstanding. Natalie's a wonderful neighbor, but she's a bit territorial. I have everything under control. One of the officers raised an eyebrow. Do you have documentation showing you have permission to use this property for an event? Karen's smile wavered again. Well, not on me, but I spoke with the council and they were fine with it. The officer turned back to Natalie. Do you have proof of ownership for this property? Natalie nodded, pulling out her deed and handing it over. The officer reviewed it and then addressed Karen again. Ma'am, this property is privately owned. Without written permission from the owner or proper permits, you and your vendors are trespassing. You need to leave immediately." Karen's face turned red, but she forced a strained smile. "Of course, we'll pack up. No need to make a big deal out of it." As the trucks began to reluctantly pull away, Natalie felt a wave of relief. But that relief was short-lived. After the officers left, Karen approached her, her cheerful facade gone. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "But this isn't over. You're not going to scare me off that easily." Natalie stared at her, unflinching. "This isn't a game, Karen. Stay off my property, or next time I'll press charges." Karen didn't respond. She turned and walked away, but her parting words left Natalie uneasy. The way she said it like a promise, not a threat, sent chills down her spine. That evening, as Natalie reviewed the footage from her cameras, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something bigger. The trucks were gone, but the damage was done. Her driveway was a mess, her garden was in worse shape than ever, and the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Natalie knew one thing for sure: Karen wasn't done, and neither was she. If Karen wanted to escalate this conflict, Natalie would be ready. The days following the second food truck fiasco were some of the most tense Natalie had ever experienced. Karen had retreated, at least temporarily, but Natalie wasn't naive enough to believe it was over. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, and Natalie felt the eyes of her neighbors on her whenever she stepped outside. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed by, the way some people avoided meeting her gaze, it was all too clear that Karen's campaign to paint her as a villain was working. But Natalie wasn't going to let Karen win. The incident with the trucks had been a wake-up call. Karen wasn't just annoying, she was calculating and relentless, and if Natalie didn't take action, the situation would only get worse. Determined to protect herself and her property, Natalie decided to take the next step. She called her lawyer, Rachel Turner, and explained everything that had happened since their last conversation. Rachel, as always, was calm and methodical. "Karen's behavior is escalating," she said. "We need to escalate our response as well. Have you continued documenting everything?" "Yes," Natalie replied. "I have footage from my cameras, photos of the damage, and even the cease and desist letter you sent." "But it doesn't seem to stop her," Rachel sighed. "Unfortunately, people like Karen don't stop unless they're forced to. The good news is, you're building a strong case. The more evidence we have, the better. Let's take a closer look at her actions and see if we can find a way to hold her accountable legally. In the meantime, we need to secure your property. Have you considered installing more physical barriers like gates or fencing?" The idea of turning her open, welcoming driveway into a fortress wasn't appealing to Natalie, but she knew it might be necessary. "I'll look into it," she said reluctantly. That evening, Natalie began researching security measures. She found a local contractor who specialized in installing automatic gates and made an appointment for an estimate. It wasn't a solution she wanted, but it felt like the only way to reclaim her peace of mind. Meanwhile, Natalie continued to document everything. She captured footage of Karen standing just outside her property line, talking animatedly with other neighbors and gesturing toward Natalie's house. She took photos of the damage left behind by the food truck's oil stains on the driveway, crushed flowers in her garden, and even a few pieces of trash that had been left behind. Then, one morning, Natalie woke to find something new in her driveway. A large, handwritten sign had been planted in the grass near the edge of her property. It read, "Save our community. Say no to selfish neighbors." Natalie stared at the sign, her anger boiling over. This was Karen's doing, there was no doubt about it. The sign was designed to provoke her, to paint her as the villain yet again. But Natalie wasn't going to take the bait. Instead, she took a photo of the sign and sent it to Rachel. Rachel called her back almost immediately. "This is harassment, plain and simple," she said. "I'm going to file for a restraining order. Karen's behavior has crossed the line, and it's time to make that clear to her." Natalie felt a wave of relief at Rachel's words. For the first time, it felt like she was regaining some control over the situation. But the relief was short-lived. That afternoon, Natalie received a letter in the mail. It was from a local government office, informing her that a formal complaint had been filed against her. According to the letter, The complaint alleged that Natalie's property was being used in a way that violated zoning laws. Specifically, it claimed that she was hosting unauthorized commercial events on her driveway. Natalie's hands trembled as she read the letter. It was ridiculous she hadn't hosted any events. Karen had been the one to organize the food trucks, not her. But the complaint had been filed in her name, and now she was being investigated. She called Rachel again, her voice shaking with frustration. "Karen filed a false complaint against me," she said. "She's trying to turn this around and make it look like I'm the one breaking the law." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then said, "This is a new tactic, but it's not uncommon. People like Karen will do anything to deflect blame and put you on the defensive. Don't worry, we'll handle this. I'll contact the zoning office and explain the situation. In the meantime, keep gathering evidence. The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Natalie spent the rest of the day combing through her documentation, organizing photos, videos, and receipts. She even found footage of Karen directing the food trucks onto her driveway, a clear indication that Karen was the one responsible for the so-called unauthorized events. But as Natalie prepared to fight back, Karen made her next move. That evening, Natalie noticed a group of people gathered in Karen's yard. They were holding what appeared to be a meeting, and Karen was standing at the center, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Natalie couldn't hear what was being said, but the way the group kept glancing toward her house made it clear that she was the topic of discussion. The next morning, Natalie woke to find that her driveway had been vandalized. Someone had poured what looked like paint thinner across the pavement, leaving large, discolored patches. Her garden beds had been trampled again, and several of her flower pots were broken. Natalie felt a lump rise in her throat as she surveyed the damage. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was malicious destruction of property. She called the police and filed a report, but she knew it would be difficult to prove who was responsible. The cameras she had installed covered the main entrance to her property but didn't capture the driveway in its entirety. That afternoon, Natalie received another letter, this time from Karen herself. It was handwritten and full of passive-aggressive language, accusing Natalie of ruining the neighborhood and creating unnecessary tension. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat: if you continue to fight against the community, don't be surprised if the community fights back. Natalie was done playing defense. She called Rachel and told her about the vandalism and the letter. Rachel's voice was firm. "This is the escalation we were expecting," she said. "I'll move forward with the restraining order immediately, and I want you to consider filing a lawsuit for damages. Karen needs to learn that her actions have consequences." Natalie agreed. She was tired of feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Karen had crossed too many lines, and it was time to push back. As Natalie prepared for the next steps, she felt a renewed sense of determination. Karen might have the upper hand for now, but Natalie wasn't going to let her win. She had the truth on her side, and with Rachel's help, she would make sure Karen faced the consequences of her actions. This wasn't just about protecting her property anymore, it was about standing up for herself and showing Karen that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. Natalie thought she had reached her breaking point after the vandalism, but Karen seemed determined to push her even further. The day after she filed the police report, Natalie noticed something odd in her mailbox. Among the usual bills and flyers was an official-looking envelope with no return address. Opening it, she found a notice claiming that her property was now under review for potential violations of local ordinances. The wording was vague, but the accusations were clear: improper use of private land for commercial purposes, unauthorized changes to the property, and disruption of community harmony. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind this. Karen wasn't just spreading rumors or stirring up trouble anymore, she was weaponizing bureaucracy against Natalie. Furious, Natalie called her lawyer, Rachel Turner, who was as calm and methodical as ever. "It's another tactic to intimidate you," Rachel said after Natalie explained the letter. "Karen is trying to bury you in red tape to distract you from the real issue. The good news is, none of this will hold up if we bring your evidence to the table." "I'm exhausted," Natalie admitted. "Every time I think she can't go any further, she finds a new way to make my life miserable." "I know," Rachel said, her voice steady. "But Karen's escalating because she's desperate. You've stood your ground, and she's trying to regain control. This is a sign that you're winning, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Despite Rachel's reassurance, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was planning something even bigger. That feeling was validated a few days later when she came home to find a group of workers unloading construction equipment near the edge of her property. They were putting up signs that read Future Community Improvement Project. Natalie's stomach dropped as she realized what Karen was doing. She stormed over to Karen's house, not even bothering to knock before Karen opened the door with her usual infuriating smile. "Oh, Natalie," Karen said sweetly. "I was just about to come over and tell you the good news. We're starting a little improvement project for the neighborhood. Isn't it exciting?" "What are you talking about?" Natalie demanded. "You have workers setting up equipment on the edge of my property. That's illegal." Karen's smile didn't waver. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Natalie. It's just a temporary setup. The neighborhood committee approved this, and it's for the good of everyone. You wouldn't want to be the only one holding us back, would you?" "There is no neighborhood committee," Natalie shot back. "You made this up, and if you think I'm going to let you take even an inch of my property, you've got another thing coming." Karen's tone turned icy. "You can fight this all you want, Natalie, but you're outnumbered. The neighborhood is tired of your negativity, and they're ready to move forward with or without your blessing." Natalie didn't bother responding. She turned on her heel and marched back to her house, her mind racing. She needed to stop this before Karen's lies spiraled even further out of control. The next day, Natalie hired a surveyor to officially mark the boundaries of her property. If Karen was going to try to encroach on her land, Natalie wanted indisputable proof of what belonged to her. She also called Rachel to inform her of the latest developments. "This is exactly what we expected," Rachel said. "Karen is trying to intimidate you by making it look like the entire neighborhood is against you. But all we need is one solid piece of evidence to prove that she's overstepping, and her house of cards will collapse." While the surveyor worked, Natalie kept a close eye on Karen's so-called project. The workers were installing stakes and ropes, clearly preparing to claim part of Natalie's property as their own. When Natalie tried to confront them, they brushed her off, claiming they were just following orders. That night, Natalie stayed up late reviewing the footage from her cameras, looking for anything she could use to prove Karen's involvement. At around midnight, she noticed something strange. A group of people appeared near the edge of her property, moving quickly in the dark. They were carrying tools and what looked like large bags. Natalie's heart pounded as she watched them dig shallow holes and place something inside before covering them up and disappearing into the night. The next morning, Natalie went to investigate. She found freshly disturbed soil near the stakes the workers had placed, but whatever had been buried was out of reach without proper tools. Suspicious, she called Rachel and described what she had seen. "That's very concerning," Rachel said. "It sounds like Karen might be trying to plant false evidence to justify her project. We need to document this immediately." Natalie took photos and videos of the disturbed soil before calling the police. When officers arrived, she explained the situation and asked them to investigate. The officers were initially skeptical, but after digging up one of the spots, they found what looked like electrical cables and piping that clearly didn't belong there. "This is tampering," one of the officers said, frowning. "We'll need to open a case and look into who's responsible for this." Karen, of course, denied everything when the police questioned her. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice dripping with indignation. "Why would I do something like that? Natalie's just trying to make me look bad because she doesn't want to support the community." But the discovery of the buried items was enough to cast doubt on Karen's claims, and the police began a formal investigation. Meanwhile, Rachel advised Natalie to file a restraining order against Karen to prevent further harassment. Karen's response to the restraining order was predictably dramatic. She organized a meeting with her remaining supporters in the neighborhood, framing herself as the victim of an unjust campaign by Natalie. Flyers appeared in mailboxes the next day, accusing Natalie of attacking community spirit and urging neighbors to stand up for what's right. But Karen's antics were starting to backfire. The more she escalated, the more people began to see through her lies. Several neighbors who had initially sided with Karen approached Natalie to apologize, admitting that they had been misled. One even provided Natalie with a recording of Karen bragging about her plans to take over Natalie's driveway and expand the food truck events into a permanent fixture. Armed with this new evidence, Natalie and Rachel prepared for the next phase of the battle. Karen might have been relentless, but Natalie was no longer the passive, polite neighbor she had once been. She was ready to fight back, and this time, she wouldn't stop until Karen faced the full consequences of her actions. The court date arrived faster than Natalie anticipated, but she was ready. With Rachel by her side, armed with an arsenal of evidence meticulously compiled over weeks of harassment, Natalie walked into the courthouse with a sense of determination she hadn't felt before. Karen had pushed her too far, and now it was time to hold her accountable. Karen arrived fashionably late, her demeanor as confident as ever. She wore an exaggerated smile, chatting with a small group of her remaining supporters who had shown up to lend her moral support. But Natalie noticed the cracks in Karen's facade. Her posture was slightly tense, and her eyes darted around the room, betraying the anxiety she was trying so hard to hide. As the hearing began, Rachel presented Natalie's case with precision and clarity. She started with the property survey, which unequivocally showed that the community improvement project Karen had initiated was encroaching on Natalie's land. She followed this with video footage of Karen directing food truck vendors onto Natalie's property, photos of the damage left behind, and even the cease and desist letter that Karen had blatantly ignored. But the turning point came when Rachel played the recording provided by one of the neighbors. In it, Karen could be heard boasting about her plans to expand the food truck events and dismissing Natalie's objections as irrelevant. The courtroom fell silent as Karen's voice echoed through the speakers. "Once this is up and running, she won't be able to stop me. The neighborhood loves me, and she'll just look like a bitter, selfish woman trying to ruin everyone's fun." Karen's lawyer immediately objected, claiming the recording was taken without her consent, but the judge allowed it to stand. The damage was done. The smug confidence Karen had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a clenched jaw and averted eyes. When it was Karen's turn to present her defense, she leaned heavily on the narrative she had been pushing from the start, that she was acting in the best interest of the community and that Natalie was an unreasonable neighbor who had blown everything out of proportion. She even brought forward a few of her staunchest supporters to testify on her behalf, but their statements were vague and easily countered by the evidence Natalie had presented. One of Karen's witnesses, a food truck owner, reluctantly admitted under cross-examination that Karen had charged him a parking fee to use Natalie's driveway, money that Karen had pocketed without informing anyone. This revelation drew gasps from the gallery and sealed Karen's fate. Rachel's closing argument was powerful and direct. "This case isn't about community spirit or neighborhood improvement," she said. "It's about one person exploiting her neighbors for personal gain, disregarding property rights, and causing significant harm in the process. Natalie Roberts has been patient and reasonable throughout this ordeal. But Karen Watson has shown nothing but contempt for the law and the people around her. It's time for this to end." The judge didn't take long to deliberate. In his ruling, he ordered Karen to pay substantial damages to Natalie for the vandalism, unauthorized use of her property, and emotional distress. He also issued a permanent injunction barring Karen from coming within 100 feet of Natalie's home or engaging in any activities that involved her property. Karen looked stunned as the verdict was read. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, shaking his head. It was over, and Karen knew it. As Natalie left the courthouse, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in months, the weight that Karen had placed on her shoulders was gone. Rachel walked beside her, a satisfied smile on her face. "You handled that beautifully," Rachel said. "Karen underestimated you, and it cost her." Natalie nodded, though she still felt a flicker of unease. Karen might have lost in court, but Natalie knew her neighbor well enough to suspect that she wouldn't give up easily. Still, for now, she could breathe again, knowing that justice had been served. When Natalie returned home, she found a small group of neighbors waiting for her. They apologized for not supporting her sooner and offered to help clean up the damage Karen had caused. One neighbor, an elderly man named Henry, shook her hand firmly and said, "You stood up to her when the rest of us were too afraid to. You did the right thing, and we're behind you now." Natalie smiled, feeling a sense of community she hadn't felt before. The battle with Karen had been exhausting and painful, but it had also shown her the importance of standing her ground. As she looked around her property, now marked with fresh survey stakes and free of Karen's meddling, Natalie felt a renewed sense of pride and ownership. Karen might still be in the background, nursing her wounded pride and plotting her next move, but Natalie wasn't afraid anymore. She had proven that she could fight back and win, and she wasn't about to let anyone take what was hers again. In the weeks following the court's decision, life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Karen Watson, once the self-proclaimed queen of community projects, had retreated into her house, rarely making public appearances. The bright, cheery facade she had maintained for so long was gone, replaced by a shadow of her former self. Her small group of loyal supporters had largely abandoned her, embarrassed by the revelations during the trial. The food trucks, once a frequent sight in the neighborhood, were gone for good. For Natalie, the change was palpable. Her driveway was finally hers again, free of unwanted vehicles and curious strangers. The damages Karen was ordered to pay covered the costs of repairing the vandalism, repainting the driveway, and restoring her garden to its former beauty. The scars left by Karen's actions, both literal and figurative, were slowly beginning to heal. Neighbors who had been distant during the height of the conflict now approached Natalie with apologies and kind words. Many admitted that they had been hesitant to get involved, fearing retaliation from Karen. A few even offered to help with yard work or cleaning up the remaining debris from the food truck fiasco. One evening, Natalie found a small potted plant on her doorstep with a note that read, "Thank you for standing up for all of us." The support was heartening, but Natalie knew it wasn't just about reclaiming her property, it was about rebuilding her sense of security. She had learned a hard lesson: protecting what was hers required vigilance and a willingness to stand her ground. Despite the legal restrictions placed on Karen, Natalie wasn't entirely convinced the feud was over. Karen had always been resourceful and manipulative, and Natalie couldn't ignore the possibility of future provocations. To prepare, she took proactive steps to safeguard her home. She installed a sturdy automatic gate at the entrance to her driveway, ensuring that no one could access her property without her consent. Additional cameras were mounted to cover every angle, and motion-activated lights illuminated the perimeter at night. As weeks turned into months, Karen remained quiet. Rumors began to circulate that she was planning to sell her house and move out of the neighborhood altogether. Natalie wasn't sure if that was true, but the thought brought a sense of relief. She didn't want to live the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for Karen's next move. One evening, as Natalie sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she reflected on everything that had happened. The driveway, once a source of so much conflict, was now quiet and peaceful, just as it should be. Her garden, filled with vibrant flowers and lush greenery, was thriving once more. The simple beauty of it all reminded her why she had fought so hard to protect it. Natalie realized that the experience had changed her. She had always been independent and self-reliant, but the conflict with Karen had tested her limits in ways she hadn't expected. It had forced her to confront her fears, stand up to intimidation, and trust in her own strength. As she watched the sun set over her now serene property, Natalie felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen might have tried to disrupt her life, but in the end, Natalie had prevailed. Her home was once again a sanctuary, a place of comfort and pride. The sound of laughter drifted over from a nearby house, where a group of neighbors had gathered for a casual barbecue. For the first time in months, Natalie felt like part of the community, not because she had been dragged into Karen's schemes, but because she had earned the respect of those around her. As the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, Natalie raised her cup in a silent toast to herself. She had fought for what was hers, and she had won. The future felt bright, and for the first time in a long while, she could finally breathe easy.